It was near the end of the call. So I said, look, that's important. Let's really dig into this next time we talk. And then I went through a whole series of emotional steps after the call. The first one was to say, what if she's right? This is horrifying.
Hey there, I'm Julie. Welcome to Uncomfy, a podcast about sticking with moments that challenge us. We share the stories of real people in moments that challenged their perspective. And instead of getting angry or shutting down, they stuck with the discomfort. They stayed curious and open, and they're glad they did. We hope these stories inspire you to stick with it too, because there is so much to gain. New empathy, deeper relationships, and more clarity about our own views. I'm glad you're here. Now, let's get uncomfy. Here's a story about unwelcome feedback from someone who's supposed to be on your side. I'm joined by McLain Smith. She's an expert on organizational learning and change. She's author of several books, including Divide or Conquer and The Elephant in the Room, and her latest is called Remaking the Space Between Us: How Citizens Can Work Together to Build a Better Future for All. Diana, welcome. It's so great to have you.
It's just great to be here, Julie, and I love this concept of uncomfy. I think it's right on target for today's times.
So your stick with it moment where you're faced with some challenging information was actually tied to the launch of your book. So we should just let people know briefly what your book is about. How would you describe it? What's the blurb on the book jacket?
Well, I think the biggest blurb is that underneath the story, which you often hear about polarization, is another story that never gets told by the press. And that is how hundreds of thousands of people across our country are working to bridge divides and to heal the social fabric of our country. And it's an extraordinary number of people. And that story does not get told. And it's an important story because it helps people see that we actually do have power at a time when I think we're all feeling so hopeless and so helpless. And I think that is something we really need to remedy, and I feel passionate about playing whatever part I can in remedying it.
What led to the situation where you got some challenging feedback?
I had been working very hard on this book because I knew that things were not going well with the country, and I wanted to get it out as quickly as I could, not because I thought it would be the holy grail, but I wanted to do my bit. And so I was working 24/7 for 2 years doing the research and the writing. And I didn't have time to do the promotion that you're supposed to start doing a year before the book gets released. So as soon as I had the book in the hands of the publisher, I pivoted to promoting the book. And I was just exhausted, and I didn't have the right support. And finally, I hired this wonderful person, Emily, to be my strategist, right-hand person. And she's watching me run around like a chicken with her head cut off, asking her to do this, and then this, and then this. And finally, she said, Diana, I think you're so committed to making an impact and feeling under so much time pressure that it's affecting your judgment and your decision making about the book and how to promote it. People aren't buying what you're selling. At which point I went, ouch, because that was a horrifying thought.
Did you want to get angry? Did you want to tell her, what in the heck are you talking about? Like, how dare you?
It's interesting. No, and there are times when I do. So it's not like I'm a saint. I think at that point it was more, took me by surprise. And it was near the end of the call. So I said, look, that's important. Let's really dig into this next time we talk. And then I went through a whole series of emotional steps after the call. The first one was to say, what if she's right? This is horrifying because I really believe that the nation needs this kind of book. So that was the first.
I've just wasted 2 years.
I've just wasted 2 years. Or I could even live with wasting 2 years, but the feeling of helplessness in the face of so much going on, that having worked as a person who does systems change for 40 years, I knew how important it was that citizens feel empowered. And so that really troubled me. But then I said, well, hold on a second, Diana. When she said they're not buying what you're selling, the question is, what does she see me selling? Because it might not be that the book is the problem, but it's how I'm positioning the book. So maybe I don't understand her point of view well enough. So I need to understand, what does she think I'm selling? And then I also need to understand, why does she think people aren't buying that? And then the last is, what kind of test have we given it? since I've been promoting for a very short period of time. So how do we really know? So I just wanted to work all that through with her.
So how did that play out for you then, Diana McLain Smith, in the context of you and your strategist? You formulated all of these questions, had all of these emotional responses, and then you reconvened to sort of probe. What did you learn? How did that go?
So I'm always aware of what the role relationship is with another person and how much work you need to do to encourage the other person to hang in there with you, okay, when they differ with you. If it's somebody who's more powerful than you, maybe less than someone who works for you, and she works for me, and she's also younger. So the first thing is I wanted to really make sure that she understood that I value deeply raising something that could be threatening to somebody. So I began by saying, I really am grateful to you for that. And I recognize that my judgment is impaired right now because of the kind of panic I'm in, and I'm running around like a crazy person. And I can imagine that's not easy for you. It's not easy for me. So I really appreciate that. So that's where I started. And I think she was a little surprised because I think it was a risk for her, and she was grateful for that. And then I said, it occurred to me that for us to really work this through, we need to think about what is it that you see me selling. Okay, so when you say, they're not buying what you're selling, what is it that you see me selling? And why is it that you think people wouldn't be buying that? And it ended up being a really interesting conversation because Emily knows my work from my previous life, working in organizations with organizational change and learning. And that's a context in which I deeply engage people in their mindsets, their underlying beliefs, help people understand the nature of their relationships with other people and how those relationships are constraining them as well as others. I really help people understand these patterns very deeply. And Emily sees great value in that. And she wasn't seeing that in what I was saying about the book. So she heard me saying the book is about all these motivating, inspiring, and empowering stories. And she's saying there are other people out there with empowering, motivating stories, but nobody out there has your ability to engage people's mindsets and the relationships they form with one another. That's what you ought to be selling. Okay? So she had a disagreement over what I was emphasizing when I went and talked about the book. And I never would have known that. And then that led to a really interesting conversation because, one question it raised for me is, I know there are hundreds of thousands of people across the country who have taken it upon themselves to bridge divides and repair our social fabric, and you never hear about them because of the way our media leads with what bleeds. I think hearing those stories is important for people. It may be insufficient, but I do believe it's necessary. So that's where we ended up talking it through and trying to figure out how can we get at the other part of my practice, which she so values and thinks is so powerful, while not losing what she agreed is the need to help people see they're not as powerless as they may think they are. And by the way, I mentioned to Emily I was going to use this vignette. And so I said, how did you feel after our conversation? She said it was one of the first times in my life where I spoke to somebody in power who saw me, valued my opinion, and actually took action upon it to do something differently. And she said, I also learned from you that I might have been giving short shrift to part of what was very important to you. So it strengthened our relationship.
Yeah, well, it seems like it paid off in a lot of great ways for you. And so I guess that leads us to talk a little bit more about this book. What is it about this? What exactly are you trying to say to America in this book, Remaking the Space Between Us? What is the space that needs to be remade so desperately that you were, frantic to get it out into the world as much as possible?
Well, during the pandemic, as I looked around at how things began to deteriorate more and more as a nation, and I read the headlines, and they were almost exclusively about how polarized and how divided we are, which is true. But there's a story beyond that wasn't getting told, and that's what I wanted to focus on, because ever since we were founded, we have lived separate lives in groups that are divided along ideological and demographic lines, okay? Now, that's not just true of the United States, it's true of the world, and it existed long before we were founded, because when we were back early in our evolution, we've discovered that we would do better hunting and surviving if we formed groups. And in those groups, we learned to cooperate. We created group norms, structures, identities, but we not only learned to cooperate within, we learned to compete across. We learned to fear across. We learned to hate across groups. And that legacy has lived up to today. Now, back then, our survival depended on developing cooperation within groups. Today, because no problems we face today of any magnitude are only affecting one group. They cross boundaries, climate change, migration, war. All of this requires cooperation across groups. So just like back in the olden days, we had to learn to cooperate within groups in order to survive, today we need to learn how to cooperate across groups to survive. And you actually already see it. More motivation to cooperate across groups. The Paris Climate Agreement was with 97 nations, and it was a negotiation process that involved cooperation. So we're learning to cooperate across groups, but we need to learn a little faster.
And that's the space between us, is the space between our groups.
No, it's two things. We're very insular within. We're too close within, and we're too distant across. So it's both. You can't bridge with another group unless you open up the mental space within your own group. So you need to do some work on yourself with your own biases, your own beliefs, and open yourself up to the possibility that maybe it's not a zero-sum world. Maybe it's not win-lose. Maybe if another group gets something, I can get something too. I won't lose something.
So it starts with self-reflection? Is that what you're saying?
Self-reflection in the context of relationships, both within groups and across groups. So I have a colleague who gets very, very angry at the other side, okay? And the response is to stereotype and ridicule. They're stupid, they don't have an education, they don't know what they're talking about. And I'll say, it's true they may not have an education. It's true they may not know all of what they're talking about on this issue, but have you stopped to think about, well, what would lead them to care so passionately about something so different from you? Okay, what would lead them to do that? And it's hard to say that to someone who's in your group. You don't want to alienate them. You don't want to estrange them. But that's where it begins. It does begin. I mean, I ask myself all the time when I find myself getting triggered, why am I finding it so hard to imagine this other person as a human being with cares and concerns and worries and hopes identical to mine? They care about their families being safe. They want a good future for their kids. They want a good job. I want those things too. Why is it so hard for me to imagine that of those people?
So in all of this writing and researching about how deeply divided we are, where do you come down now today as we head into the 2024 presidential election in a very fraught emotional time in America? Do you have, on a scale of 1 to 10, how hopeful are you? 10 being, we have got this figured out, we can do this. And 1 being like, I don't know, it may be too late.
It's funny. I start my talks by asking people on a scale of 0 to 5, how hopeful are you about the future? Okay. And yeah. I told somebody who was interviewing me about that, and they said, so where do you fall on that? So I'll do it on your 0 to 10 scale. And here's how I answered. I remain very optimistic. I'd give it about an 8. And the reason for that is I'm a student of history. We have been through many, many crises that have asked us to say who we want to be as a people and as a nation. And increasingly over the course of that time, we have expanded the circle of who we include. And I believe we will do that again. I don't know if we'll do it in this election. I don't know if it'll be the next one. I think in the short term, it's anybody's bet. I think we're in for a good deal of pain. And that's why I think people need to never forget that they still have choice, they still have power, and they need to decide whether they're on the side of repairing our country and rebuilding our country and making it as strong as it can be as a multi-group democracy, or whether they want to try to go back to a time where you try to airbrush out of the picture one or another group. They won't stand for it anymore. That's not a moral statement. It's just reality. So I trust that the American people will eventually side on the side of expanding the circle, but we're in for some pain.
Diana McLain Smith is an organizational learning and change expert, and her latest book is Remaking the Space Between Us: How Citizens Can Work Together to Build a Better Future for All. Thank you so much for your time and your stories today, Diana. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for getting uncomfy with us today. I'd love to hear about a situation you've experienced where you found yourself challenged or out of your comfort zone, and you chose to stick with the discomfort rather than bail out or get defensive and shut down your curiosity. How did it go for you? Drop a line to uncomfy@byu.edu. We may even feature you on the podcast. And be sure to check out my other podcast called Top of Mind. Each episode explores one tough topic in a way that will help you practice staying open and curious in the face of challenging perspectives. And we've actually done a number of episodes about polarization and about why it happens and group dynamics and some of the things we can do to overcome that. So be sure to check out the Top of Mind feed through the last year to find some of those episodes. You can find Top of Mind on any podcast app. Uncomfy is a BYU radio podcast. Samuel Benson produces it, and the team includes Enrique Prado, James Hoops, Sam Payne, and Brendan Lewis. Our theme music was composed by Kelsey Ney. I'm Julie Rose. Can't wait to get uncomfy with you again next week. Hey there, friends. I want to take just a quick moment and dive into another gem of a podcast from the BYU radio family. It's The Lisa Show, hosted by Lisa Valentine Clark. She's a comedian, an actress, a believer, and a single mom. And she was even our very first guest on Uncomfy, you may remember, talking about a really uncomfortable conversation with a close friend of hers. So what's The Lisa Show about? Well, it's kind of like sitting down to chat with your favorite people about what's going on in life, all of life's challenges. They tackle parenting, mental health, social issues, always with a lot of laughs, because it's Lisa. So if you are up for figuring out this crazy thing called life, give The Lisa Show a listen. You can find it anywhere you get your podcasts.